Can we trust the accounts of the life of Jesus of Nazareth? Why should we trust these guys? How do we know they were even there? How do we know they're accurate? How do we know they weren't making stuff up because they had some kind of ulterior motive? All this and more today on the Legati Christi podcast. Welcome back to the Eyewitness Christi podcast. I'm your host, David W. Gilmore. Last time we started looking at evidence for the reliability of the accounts of the life of Jesus of Nazareth. And I said that there are 10 pieces of evidence, 10 facts that we have to evaluate regarding the Gospels that will tell us whether the Bible is trustworthy or not. Last time, I made the case that the books of the New Testament were written by people who could have been there, right next to Jesus when he was alive and teaching. And I showed that we can tell by what they said and what they left out that the authors had an intimate knowledge of the people, places, and things of the time when Jesus lived. And they couldn't have been written generations later. I'll leave a link to that episode in the show notes. But just because we can demonstrate that someone was at the scene of a crime doesn't mean that the witness is reliable and can be trusted. Like I said in our episode on what counts as evidence, eyewitnesses often lie. So we have to figure out if we can trust them or not. One type of show my wife and I love to watch is true crime type stuff like 2020 and Dateline and things like that, First 48. And part of the show is when the cops bring the witnesses out into an interrogation room and start asking questions. Investigators have to quickly determine if this person that's in front of them is telling them the truth or not. And a lot of the times they're lying. They don't want to be implicated. They're covering up for someone, or maybe they did it. I said that the original authors of the New Testament were eyewitnesses. Unfortunately, we can't pull them into the interrogation room like the TV shows and question them like we can people who are still alive. These guys died 2,000 years ago, and the case we're investigating is 2,000 years old too. What we need is a framework, like a series of questions or checkpoints that we can use, like a checklist, to evaluate whether or not these guys were telling the truth or not. We need to run our eyewitnesses through this checklist to figure out if they have ulterior motives, if they're accurate, if they're lying, or if they're even telling the truth. Now, when I want to know how to evaluate evidence or eyewitness testimony, the person that I turn to immediately is J. Warner Wallace. You've heard me mention his name before. He's a former cold case homicide detective from Los Angeles, so he has a long career of evaluating eyewitness testimonies. In fact, one of the reasons that Jim perked up about the Gospels was when he read them as an atheist, he recognized them as ancient eyewitness testimony. And the fact that these authors had been dead for thousands of years didn't deter him at all, because as a cold case detective, a lot of the eyewitness testimony that he has to deal with came from people who weren't alive anymore. In a lot of cases, even the officers who took the statements weren't alive anymore. And yet he was able to consistently solve his cases even without access to a lot of the witnesses. In his book, Cold Case Christianity, Wallace gives a list of criteria that he used in his investigations to determine if someone was a reliable eyewitness. He has a chapter in his book on each one of these qualifications, but I'm just going to briefly summarize them in this episode. For a little fun example of demonstrating eyewitness accounts and how to test if they're accurate or not, let's talk about an account that I could give you of one of my most memorable moments in my teenage years. And that's when I went to see Pink Floyd in concert in 1994. What follows is an eyewitness account of the events of that day. And there was a very specific thing that happened on that day, at that concert. Something that didn't happen at any other Pink Floyd concert as far as I know. On that day, in the spring of 1994, a pig fell from the sky. The show took place in what we call the Horseshoe in Columbus, Ohio, in support of Pink Floyd's then recent release of the Vision Bell. The Horseshoe is where the Ohio State Buckeyes play football. I went to the concert with my friends, John, Donnie, and Donnie's brother-in-law, Scott. Before the concert, there was a pre-show event thrown by a local radio station called 99.7 The Blitz. Some local bands played on a stage there at the event, and I even bought a t-shirt there. It was black with pink letters on the front that said The Blitz, and the date of the event on the back. During the show, John and I sat in an upper area of the stadium to the back right of the stage. The stage was at the open end of the horseshoe, and we were about the 30-yard line on the opposite end of the field. Donnie and Scott had seats on the field much closer to the action. On both sides of the stage were these large triangle-shaped containers. During the song One of These Days, the containers burst open and large inflatable pigs come out of them. They stayed mostly in the containers and they bob up and down along with the music. This is a common staple of a Pink Floyd concert. These pigs pop out and they bob up and down to the music. They have these spotlights that come out of their eyes and they go up and down the audience, kind of like, searchlights looking for some kind of miscreants or something. Now, suddenly, unexpectedly, about halfway through the song, the pig on our side of the stage floated down to the ground, turning into a deflated mass of fabric on the floor of the stadium. Now, that's a very interesting story, and I'm claiming to be an eyewitness to something unique. How can you tell if I am a reliable eyewitness to this event? What reasons would you have to trust me when I tell you that this pig accidentally fell from the set? The first thing you want to know about me is, as an eyewitness, was I present? Was I actually there? Detectives look at eyewitness statements to determine if the person was actually at the crime when it occurred. When detectives evaluate eyewitness statements, they look for how the eyewitness described the environment where the incident took place. Did they use the right names? Did they describe the buildings correctly? Did they point out people who could have been there? In other words, the people that they point out didn't have an alibi that they were someplace else. In the case of the flying pig, I gave several details about that day that you could check out. I told you there was a pre-show by a local radio station across from the stadium. I described where we sat. I described the stage, and I described which of the pigs got loose. You could double check those facts to see if it's an accurate description that put me there in that place at that time. One way you could tell if I was there or not was if you asked me about a specific feature of the stadium, and that's the open end of the horseshoe. If you were asking me about that event and I told you that the end was all closed in like a regular stadium, you know that I wasn't there. The end of the stadium wasn't permanently filled in until 2001, and that's 7 years after the concert. Up until then, the stadium was open-ended, and there were temporary bleachers that filled in that end of the stadium. In fact, you would be able to see the music acts walk from the stage through the bleachers to the buses that were parked behind the bleachers, and then they would leave the stadium. Investigators could also ask me more general questions about the horseshoe to see if I really have familiarity with the building. Like they could ask me where it is. And I better say it's on OSU's campus next to the Olentangy River. If I told you that it was along the Ohio River or it was up in Cleveland, you would immediately know that I wasn't there. You'd also know that I wasn't from Ohio because I screwed up the geography royally, and everyone from Ohio knows where the horseshoe is. Also, in a trial, they'll only allow eyewitness testimony. They won't allow testimony from second or third-hand accounts. Let's say I went and told a bunch of my friends who weren't there what I saw. If they then tell the investigators that they heard me say that the pig fell, that wouldn't be admissible in court because they weren't a direct eyewitness. That's called hearsay. They only want people who were actually there to testify. The second criteria for someone being a reliable eyewitness is were their accounts corroborated? Did other eyewitnesses say something similar? Do other pieces of evidence, like a handprint on a counter or a video camera at a different angle, back up the details that the eyewitness gave? A big piece of evidence to show that I might have been there would be a concert ticket, because that would show the date, the place, and where I sat. Actually, I think I still have the ticket in a box somewhere. Up until a few years ago, I still had the black T-shirt with the pink writing from the Blitz Bash, and I used to have a concert T-shirt too. Now you can buy the same T-shirts online that you can get at a concert, but it didn't used to be like that. Concert T-shirts used to be sold exclusively at the concert, and people used to wear them around like badges of honor to let everyone know that they were at the concert. My account could also be corroborated by other eyewitnesses. You could ask my friends if they saw the same thing. And I mean, heck, you could potentially ask another 80,000 people if they saw the same thing as well, because they were all in the stadium. Next, we want to know if the eyewitness accounts are accurate. This requirement has to do with how their story is over time. In other words, if you go back 2, 5, 10 years later, is their story still the same? Or did it change over time? If you witness something spectacular, like a pig falling from the sky, you'll remember the core elements of that event for a long time. Some of the details may get fuzzy, but the main points won't change. This is a reason that you often hear detectives interviewing a suspect or an eyewitness multiple times. Part of the reason is to see if they get more details, but part of the reason is to also see if their story changes the more times they have to tell it. That statement that I read off about the Pink Floyd concert, I wrote that today in 2026. That's 32 years later. Now, I've certainly forgotten some stuff. Like there could have been a couple more people there. I don't remember. I feel like there was more people, but I don't remember. I remember them being at the Blitz Bash, but I don't think they actually came into the concert. But the number of eyewitnesses that I tell you isn't relevant to the pig falling from the sky. I also don't remember the entire set list, but I remember that song because of what happened. The key moments I remember decades later, like the pre-show, who I sat with, and that the pig fell from the sky. Those are the important factors. But if I made it up, it's hard to keep track of that lie over time because it wasn't embedded in my mind like a real memory would be. I might start embellishing the story. For the first few weeks, I might tell one version. If I made it up, though, I might forget which side. Like, for example, I might forget what side of the stage the pig was on. One time I might tell the story and the pig was on the left, and one time I might tell the story and the pig was on the right. And if I'm lying, I may change the song every once in a while. Like maybe one time it was Another Brick in the Wall, and one time it was One of These Days, and so I may change that detail. I may forget which song it is if I make it up. In the case of the crime, what often makes a story change is the pressure being put on by the investigators. Maybe at first a witness might lie to protect the suspect, or maybe they're lying to point suspicion at the suspect. But if the investigators come back to them enough and they're lying, it's going to be harder for them to keep the story straight, or they might feel guilty eventually and start telling the truth, and the real truth might come out. But if their story stays the same, no matter the pressure being put on them, or how much time has passed, then that's a good sign that their account can be trusted. And finally, the fourth thing in our list of criteria that we use to evaluate an eyewitness is to determine whether they would have been biased or not. Did they have some reason to lie, to either protect someone else or throw an enemy under the bus, for example? For my account of the falling pig, the context of when I'm telling the story matters. There's a few reasons that I might lie about seeing a flying pig at a Pink Floyd concert. Most of the reasons have to do with impressing people. Maybe I'm in the midst of other Pink Floyd fans and I want a cool story to be able to tell them so they think I'm cool. As a teenager, maybe somehow this story would have impressed some girl, I don't know. But for the record, my wife is not impressed by Pink Floyd stories. She's not a big fan of Pink Floyd. Now, another reason I might make up the story is because maybe I want the rigging guy's job, or at least I want him fired for some reason. So I might make up this story to tell his boss to get him fired so that I can take his job. All right, so we use these 4 points to evaluate an eyewitness statement. Let's say I did have ulterior motives to tell that story. Maybe I started adding things to it over time. But as long as it's corroborated, that doesn't matter. If other people or other places or dates back up parts of my story, then we should trust those parts too. So if we take this list of criteria and we move it over to evaluating the gospel authors, Jim did this, and what he found in his book, he used this 4-point framework to evaluate the eyewitness accounts of the Gospels to see if they're reliable on what they say about Jesus. The first test is if the eyewitnesses could have been present. Hearsay from people within the same time window is one thing, but accounts that come hundreds of years later from multiple generations later, that's completely different. So if this testimony is like that, it's harder to trust it. And I did a whole episode on this point last time, and I showed that the accounts of Jesus' life that we have in the Bible were written by people who were there and can be dated early. The language they used was appropriate for the time. The names of the places they used was appropriate for the area that the account takes place in. They left out key elements of the history of Rome and Jerusalem that would have been present if they were writing later. And they cited each other in ways that shows an order of being written. Remember, Paul quotes the Gospel of Luke in his letters in the 50s, and Luke cites a lot of Mark. So that means that Mark had to come before Luke, and Mark had to have been written early. Remember last time I cited a lot of sources that we have for the ancient history, for the Caesars, for Alexander the Great, for some of the wars that happened. I showed how most of the sources for those events came hundreds of years after the events that they actually record. Most historical sources weren't written by eyewitnesses. The sources for Alexander the Great and Tiberius Caesar came generations later. They weren't even alive when their subjects were alive, so they couldn't have been there. They weren't eyewitnesses, yet they're part of the trusted historical record of these people and places. Next, we want to know if the accounts can be corroborated. Is there any evidence that backs up what the eyewitnesses had to say about Jesus? Now, keep in mind, we don't have just one source on the life of Jesus. We have 4, and they back each other up a lot. Do they read exactly the same? No. But you would expect from different eyewitnesses to have slightly different accounts. If the stories were exactly the same, you'd be right to question whether they copied one another or not. Now, I think a fair objection would be that the reason that these 4 accounts back each other up is because they were in on the crime together. Like, the crime being that they fabricated the story of Jesus for some reason. This isn't a problem for us, though, because we have multiple non-Christian sources who we could even consider as hostile witnesses in a trial. They didn't like Christians, but they said things that backed up parts of the gospel accounts. These sources include ancient historians and writers like Thallus, Plagian, Cornelius Tacitus, Marabar Serapion, Pliny the Younger, and Josephus. And now I'm going to do a whole episode on those sources later where we'll go through each one of those sources in detail. I'm not going to go into them right now because it would make the show too long. But the point is, we have multiple hostile witnesses that back up and corroborate what the other gospel authors had to say. But what we see when we read these sources is that they back up a lot of what the New Testament authors recorded. Things like the fact that Jesus lived, that he was a wise teacher who accurately predicted future events. He was executed by Jewish leaders as overseen by Pontius Pilate, and a whole lot more. These sources corroborate at least 13 points of the story laid out in the Gospels by the other eyewitnesses of Jesus' life. Now remember what I also said about the passage of time, and that's important, and the amount of pressure over time being applied to the eyewitnesses. The longer a story is strung along, the more chance there is for a person to forget what they said previously and to change some part of the story or some part of his lie. Or the more pressure that's put on him, the more likely it is that he'll crack and tell the truth, if he's lying. We know that the authors of the New Testament never changed their stories over time. And a lot of them died as martyrs, never recanting even to save their own lives. In his massive tome entitled The Fate of the Apostles, Sean McDowell goes over the historical record of what happened to Jesus' inner circle. We can know with confidence that many of these men were martyred because of what they proclaimed. And while we don't know the exact facts of all of them, what we do know is that they were willing to die, at least. We know that Peter, Paul, James the brother of John, and James the brother of Jesus were all executed. The scholarship also shows that Thomas and Andrew were likely martyrs as well. The other apostles is less clear, but the point is that none of them ever changed their stories, even at the threat of death. Now, just in case someone wants to point out that people are often willing to die for what they believe, I would say yes, they do. But people don't die for what they know is a lie. If I went to a country and was killed because I wouldn't recant what I believe about Jesus, that's one thing. But if I was there and I knew we were all lying, I'd want to save my own skin. I might even lie to save my own skin. But I would never keep telling what I knew was a lie if it was going to get me killed. And finally, we need to examine the motives of the authors. These guys had no reason to lie. These men had nothing to gain and everything to lose by writing and doing what they did. They had no motivation to lie. Sure, in the 4th century, when Constantine became emperor of Rome, the church started to have a lot of power and influence. But for the first 300 years after Jesus' death, his followers were often persecuted. Power, wealth, and prestige were the opposite of the life that they led. If these guys had some sort of hidden agenda, it wasn't one that I'd want to be part of. The account given in the Gospels seems like a weird one to make up, too. The Jews already saw themselves as set apart, as the children of God. Yet the account that they gave veers away from a lot of the cultural beliefs pretty dramatically. And, at that time, in the culture, to not follow the rules meant meant that you were kicked out at best and stoned to death at worst. As Wallace likes to tell us, every crime is motivated by one of three things: sex, money, or power. So if these men had some sort of hidden agenda, what was it? Sure, 400 years later, the church began to amass its wealth and power. But in the beginning, you were more likely to end up getting run out of town, or worse. I mean, what a terrible conspiracy, right? Think about this. This is the conversation that would have gone on. Hey guys, I have this great plan. Let's break away from our cultural leaders, put our lives and the lives of our families at risk, go broke, and spend the rest of our days wandering around the Middle East, getting chased from town to town. Oh, and we might likely end up dead. Who's with me? I mean, come on. Another thing that struck me was the person of Paul. Paul's one of the most puzzling conspirators, if that's what we want to call him. Why would he join in with this band of social outcasts? He was on the road to power and a life of luxury. He was climbing the Pharisee ladder to the top, and in a hurry. Why would he give that up? He had already won at life. Why would he turn to the life of itinerant preacher and a tent maker, who, among other things, was arrested numerous times? He was also stoned. He was left for dead. He was arrested and shipwrecked. Why would he do this? He already had it made, and he took this alternate life that ultimately led to his death. The point is that the gospel authors said and did a lot of things that got them into a lot of trouble. It didn't get them ahead in life, not in this one at least. They said and did the things that they did because they were eyewitnesses of the events, and they knew that they were true. The events that they reported on and the way of life that they taught, they believed it was true, and they lived it out in front of everyone. There was no hidden agenda, no ulterior motive. There was no conspiracy. What you see is what you get. One thing I didn't mention about Jim Wallace was he used to be an atheist. But when he started reading the Gospels, he immediately recognized that these are eyewitness testimony, and he knew he had a framework to evaluate whether they could be trusted or not. They passed every test. In fact, it was because they met all of the criteria that Jim started paying attention to what the reporters had to say, as an atheist. In other words, the people whose names are attributed to the Gospels are the ones who wrote them shortly after the events that they record. We don't have one eyewitness to count for the life of Jesus. We have 4. All of the things that they record, the cities, the people, the buildings, the geography, are all accurate to the time that they record. Based on all of this, we can comfortably say that the Gospels were written by people who were actually there to witness the life of Jesus of Nazareth, and the testimony that they gave should be trusted.